Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a desert, quiet, untouched, stretching endlessly beneath a pale horizon. No pipelines, no refineries, no foreign bases. Only sand and silence. But beneath that silence, something waited. Something the world had not yet discovered. A force powerful enough to reshape nations, shatter empires, and draw every major power on Earth toward the Middle East. Most people today believe the conflict in the region is ancient, rooted in religion, tribes, or cultural divisions. But the truth is far simpler and far more explosive. The real story begins in 1908. In the scorching heat of southern Persia, a British drilling team hit something thick and dark. It surged upward with a roar, crude oil, pooling at their feet, sinking into their boots. They didn't celebrate. They didn't understand what they had awakened. But thousands of miles away, in London, someone did. Within just a few years, the British Navy made a decision that would change global power forever. It abandoned coal and switched entirely to oil. That single choice transformed oil from a commodity into a weapon of strategy, a resource that could decide wars, determine empires, and fuel the rise of modern civilization. And suddenly, the Middle East, a region long ignored by Western powers, became the center of the world's ambitions. But here is the part almost no one talks about. The people who lived above the oil didn't control it. Not the wells, not the profits, not the future. Foreign companies swept across the region. Contracts were signed in languages local leaders didn't speak. Borders were drawn by men who had never stepped onto the land. And kings were chosen, not by their people, but by nations looking for obedient partners. What looked like progress was really the construction of a quiet, invisible cage. The Middle East had become the most valuable real estate on Earth, and the world wasn't planning to let go. But here's the question no one asked. What happens when every major superpower depends on a region that has almost no control over its own resources? Because the answer would ignite the first great shock wave, and this pressure was about to erupt in ways the world never expected. The first oil discovery didn't just attract attention, it triggered a global race. Once Britain realized how powerful oil could be, other nations moved quickly. American companies arrived with deeper pockets, French diplomats negotiated in silence, and German strategists mapped routes they didn't yet control. Everyone wanted a piece of the same treasure. But here's the reality few understood at the time. The Middle East was not prepared for the kind of game that was now unfolding. Instead of letting local leaders control their own land, foreign powers began creating alliances based not on trust, but on convenience. Some rulers were supported, others quietly removed, and some were simply replaced. Oil wasn't just fuel anymore. It became a bargaining chip, the kind that could crown a king or collapse a government in a single night. But the most dangerous shift was still coming. As pipelines spread across deserts and tankers carried millions of barrels across the seas, a new idea emerged among world powers. If you control the oil, you control the world. And this idea changed everything. Because soon, oil would no longer be protected. It would be fought over. Armies would march not for land, but for the black liquid beneath it. The Middle East was becoming the center of a global struggle, and no one living there could escape what was coming next. And that leads us forward to the moment when nations stopped negotiating and began preparing for war. The discovery of oil brought wealth to the Middle East, but almost none of it stayed in the hands of the people who lived there. When foreign companies first arrived, they came with promises of modernization, jobs, and progress. But behind those promises were contracts written with one purpose: to ensure that outsiders, not the local nations, would control the oil. In the early decades of the 20th century, Western corporations secured deals that looked legal on paper, but were deeply unbalanced in reality. Some governments in the region received barely 10% of the profits. Meanwhile, billions of dollars flowed into foreign banks and foreign capitals. It didn't take long for ordinary citizens to realize what was happening. Wells were pumping day and night. Tankers sailed out of the Gulf carrying fortunes. And yet the people who lived above those fields remained poor. Their towns underdeveloped, their governments weak, their future traded away behind closed doors. This imbalance didn't just create anger. It created something far more explosive: a crisis of legitimacy. If a nation cannot control its own resources, can it truly call itself sovereign? Leaders who cooperated too closely with foreign powers were seen as traitors. Leaders who resisted were seen as threats by the very nations that depended on their oil. And between these pressures, many governments began to crack. Gradual rise in tension. In some countries, the elite grew richer while the public grew poorer. In others, rulers relied on foreign backing to stay in power, not on the support of their own people. This produced a cycle that would define the region for decades: corruption at the top, frustration at the bottom, and a widening gap between the promise of oil and the reality of daily life. Foreign intervention, local discontent, and political fragility merged into a single pressure point, one that grew heavier with every barrel exported. And soon, this pressure would ignite movements, revolutions, and leaders who dared to challenge the world's most powerful nations. A confrontation was coming, not over borders, not over ideology, but over who truly owned the lifeblood of the modern world. And as the stakes rose, one man would step forward in a move so bold it threatened to shake the entire global system. The fall of the Ottoman Empire left the Middle East wide open, an entire region suddenly without a center of gravity. And in that vacuum, foreign powers moved quickly, drawing borders not with understanding, but with rulers and ink. After World War I, Britain and France sat around polished tables in European offices, far away from the deserts they planned to reshape. They divided entire nations with a few strokes of a pen, lines that ignored tribes, languages, and centuries of shared history. To them, it wasn't about culture or identity. It was about control. Britain carved out Iraq and Jordan. France took Syria and Lebanon. Each region was turned into a political puzzle, designed not to unite, but to depend. They placed kings who had never stepped foot on the soil they were meant to rule. They crafted governments that looked stable on paper, but fragile in reality. And they made sure every new nation would need foreign guidance and foreign protection. It was a quiet strategy, one that did not need armies to enforce. Just contracts, just diplomacy, just influence. The Middle East became a map engineered for instability.
Borders sliced through tribal lands, separating families on opposite sides of invisible lines. Cities that once belonged to the same cultural world were suddenly given different rulers, different policies, different futures. A region that should have grown together was designed to grow apart. The colonial powers understood something important. As long as these new states stayed divided, their resources stayed accessible, their governments stayed manageable, and their oil stayed flowing outward.
By the late 20th century, the Middle East had become a map defined not by its people, but by the ambitions layered over its land. Every corridor of desert, every narrow strait, every pipeline stretching across sand held strategic meaning. And the more valuable the region became, the more the great powers returned, openly, aggressively, and with new tools of influence. But this time, they didn't come as colonizers with flags. They came as partners, liberators, peacekeepers, words that sounded noble, but concealed a clear objective: control over energy routes that could no longer be left in uncertain hands. And when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the world witnessed just how fast global powers would mobilize when oil was threatened. Armies crossed continents, warships surrounded the Gulf. The conflict wasn't just about sovereignty, it was about the flow of millions of barrels moving through the arteries of the world economy. As bombs fell, pipelines burned. Black smoke curled into the sky. Entire oil fields were set ablaze, turning daylight into darkness. This wasn't just a war, it was a message. Interrupt the oil supply, and the world will come for you. But after the fires were extinguished and Kuwait was reclaimed, the presence of foreign power didn't fade. It settled deeper. Military bases expanded, strategic agreements tightened, intelligence networks grew, and every nation with resources found itself under a microscope. Every political shift monitored, every uprising analyzed, every new leader evaluated for one question: would they protect the global energy system or disrupt it? Meanwhile, inside the region, frustration swelled. People saw the wealth beneath their feet, yet lived with instability shaped by decisions made far beyond their borders. They saw regimes rise and fall, not by elections or revolutions alone, but by the interests of nations waiting just beyond the horizon. And in this pressure, between local aspirations and global ambitions, new tensions were born. Extremist groups exploited chaos. Regional rivalries hardened. Proxy wars erupted. The struggle was no longer simply about oil itself, but about who controlled the states that managed it. Every decade brought a new conflict. Every conflict reshaped alliances. And every alliance circled back to the same resource. By the dawn of the 21st century, one truth had become undeniable. The Middle East was no longer a battleground of nations. It had become the beating heart of global strategy, and every heartbeat echoed across oceans. But the greatest shift was still ahead, a moment when foreign powers would no longer hide their intentions behind diplomacy, a moment when war would be justified not by territory, but by the promise of freedom. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Lost Chapter for more untold history and stories hidden beneath the surface of our world. See you in the next chapter.